Imagine waking up one morning determined to make a meaningful change. Perhaps you promise yourself that today you will finally start that important project, say no to unnecessary obligations, or resist a familiar temptation. Yet as the day unfolds, you catch yourself scrolling through your phone, agreeing to tasks you resent, or reaching for comfort food without thinking. By the end of the day, disappointment settles in and you wonder, why am I standing in my own way? This puzzling experience lies at the heart of self-sabotage, a subtle, often invisible force that quietly undermines our goals, dreams, and even our happiness. At its core, self-sabotage is behavior that creates problems in daily life and interferes with long-standing goals. It is not just about making the occasional poor choice. Rather, it is a pattern, a way of acting, or sometimes not acting, that consistently blocks what we truly want. Psychologists describe this as a paradox. People undermine their own goals and aspirations, even when they deeply desire the opposite. This contradiction confounds not only those who experience it, but also those who study it. Why would anyone intentionally, or even unconsciously, stand in their own way? Self-sabotage appears in countless forms, many so familiar they often go unnoticed. Procrastination is perhaps the most recognizable. You know you need to begin, but a vague discomfort or anxiety nudges you to delay. This is not always about laziness. More often, it is driven by fear of failure or worry about what the outcome might mean. The task grows larger in your mind, and avoidance becomes a temporary refuge. Yet the relief is brief, soon replaced by stress and self-reproach as deadlines approach. Other forms of self-sabotage are less obvious. Perfectionism is a prime example. On the surface, striving for excellence seems admirable, but when nothing is ever good enough, progress stalls. The pursuit of perfection can paralyze, trapping you in endless revisions, second-guessing, and dissatisfaction, ultimately derailing the very goal you set out to achieve. Negative self-talk is another silent saboteur. That inner critic, whispering doubts and criticisms, can shrink your sense of possibility. Thoughts like, "I am not good enough," or "I always mess things up," can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Over time, these internal messages erode motivation, making you less likely to take risks or persist through challenges. Self-sabotaging behavior is not limited to work or personal projects. It can seep into relationships, finances, health, and nearly every area of life. In relationships, self-sabotage might mean pushing people away, avoiding intimacy, or refusing to address conflicts. Sometimes, people avoid entering relationships altogether, rush through them too quickly, or emotionally check out instead of working through difficulties. With money, self-sabotage might look like shopping when you need to save, or gambling despite knowing the risks. When it comes to health, it could be comfort eating, substance abuse, or neglecting exercise, even though you know these habits are harmful. A striking feature of self-sabotage is that people are often unaware they are doing it. Even when they recognize a behavior as self-defeating, that awareness alone rarely leads to change. This is partly because self-sabotage is not simply a rational decision gone wrong. It often stems from deeper, conflicting needs. There may be a conscious desire for achievement, but beneath it, an unconscious fear of failure or of the changes that success could bring. These opposing forces create a tug-of-war that keeps progress just out of reach. The roots of self-sabotage can be complex. Sometimes, it is a learned survival strategy, ways of coping that once offered protection, even if they now cause harm. For example, someone who learned to avoid conflict as a child might struggle to speak up in adult relationships, inadvertently undermining their own needs. Others might avoid taking risks not because they lack ambition, but because their nervous system is trying to shield them from potential disappointment or pain. In this way, self-sabotage is not a sign of being broken or lazy. It is often an attempt, however misguided, to protect oneself from perceived threats or discomfort. Recognizing self-sabotage in ourselves can be surprisingly difficult. These behaviors often masquerade as ordinary habits or justified decisions. Still, there are common signs that can help bring these patterns into focus. Chronic procrastination is a red flag, especially when it consistently blocks progress toward important goals. Perfectionism, with its endless revisions and fear of releasing anything less than flawless, is another. Negative self-talk, particularly when it is harsh or persistent, chips away at self-esteem and enthusiasm. Other signs include always saying yes to others at the expense of your own needs, reluctance to admit mistakes, or a tendency to avoid important decisions. Self-sabotage can also appear as a need for immediate gratification, choosing short-term comfort over long-term benefit. This might mean repeatedly hitting the snooze button instead of getting up for a workout, or seeking comfort in food or substances during stressful times. Repeating unhealthy patterns in relationships, isolating yourself, or withdrawing from challenges are all ways self-sabotage keeps us stuck. Some people find themselves trapped in cycles of distraction, addiction, or obsessive behaviors that undermine their own goals. Even defense mechanisms can play a role. Defensiveness, refusing to take responsibility, or struggling to be present in important moments can all serve as subtle forms of self-sabotage. Poor time management, overspending, self-criticism, and the inability to forgive oneself after mistakes are additional clues. The effects of self-sabotage ripple outward, touching not only our own lives but also those around us. Careers can stall, relationships fray, and personal growth slows to a crawl. Over time, the accumulation of these small self-defeating acts can foster a sense of defeat and confusion. People may wonder why they cannot seem to move forward, or why happiness and success remain out of reach, despite their efforts. One important truth about self-sabotage is that it is always detrimental, whether conscious or unconscious. It interferes with goals, relationships, and well-being, often increasing anxiety and overwhelming the very person it seeks, in some paradoxical way, to protect. Ultimately, it is our responsibility to recognize and, when possible, manage these tendencies. It is also important to understand that self-sabotage is not simply a matter of willpower or character. It can be deliberate, impulsive, or habitual, and sometimes it is linked to underlying mental or neurodevelopmental conditions. Early psychological research, dating back to Freud and Ferenczi, recognized how trauma can sow the seeds for self-destructive behavior, particularly in children. While not everyone who self-sabotages has experienced trauma, the connection highlights just how deep and complex these patterns can be. Understanding self-sabotage begins with awareness. By noticing the thoughts, feelings, and actions that consistently undermine your goals, you take the first step toward change. This process is not about blame or shame, but about seeing clearly the invisible enemy within, one that, once understood, can gradually lose its power. Self-sabotage is a universal human struggle, a curious fact of life where we sometimes harm ourselves even as we strive to do better. By learning to recognize its many faces, whether in procrastination, perfectionism, negative self-talk, or avoidance, we can begin to unravel these patterns. With time, patience, and compassion, it is possible to shift from being your own worst enemy to your own best ally, clearing the path toward the life you truly want. To understand why people so often find themselves caught in cycles of self-sabotage, we must look beneath the surface beyond visible actions and into the roots that nourish these patterns. Psychological research points us to a tangle of emotions, beliefs, and past experiences that serve as the soil from which self-defeating behaviors grow. At the heart of these roots are powerful forces: fear of failure, fear of success, low self-esteem, imposter syndrome, and the often unseen influence of past trauma. Each of these factors can quietly shape how we act, react, and relate to our own ambitions. Fear is a frequent companion in the landscape of self-sabotage. For some, it is the fear of failure, a deep apprehension that any attempt might lead to disappointment or reveal shortcomings. For others, paradoxically, it is the fear of success. The prospect of reaching a goal can be just as unsettling as falling short, especially if it threatens to disrupt familiar routines or brings expectations one feels unprepared to meet. These fears are not always conscious. They can hide behind rationalizations, such as convincing oneself that the timing is not right or that more preparation is needed, when in reality it is discomfort with change or the unknown that whispers caution. Imposter syndrome is another thread woven through self-sabotaging behavior. It is the persistent sense that one's accomplishments are undeserved, and that any success is simply the result of luck or timing rather than skill or effort. This underlying belief can lead people to downplay their achievements, avoid new opportunities, or undermine their own progress. Over time, this internalized doubt becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, reinforcing the very fears that keep a person stuck. Low self-esteem lies at the core of many self-defeating actions. When someone doubts their abilities or believes they are undeserving of happiness, success, or love, it becomes all too easy to act in ways that confirm these beliefs. These actions are rarely dramatic. More often, they are small decisions that accumulate over time. A reluctance to speak up in a meeting, a tendency to minimize one's own needs, or a pattern of settling for less than one deserves. The internal narrative driving these choices is often one of self-doubt, with thoughts like, "I do not really belong here," or "I am not good enough." Such beliefs are not simply thoughts, they are learned responses, often shaped by early experiences and repeated over years until they feel like indisputable truths. The fear of change and the comfort of the familiar also play a powerful role in keeping self-sabotage alive. Change, even when positive, can be unsettling. The unknown brings uncertainty, and for many, this is enough to trigger anxiety or avoidance. There is a strange safety, after all, in what is known, even when what is known is dissatisfaction or struggle. Psychologists refer to the concept of secondary gain, the idea that even harmful behaviors can provide subtle advantages, such as the relief of avoiding risk, the comfort of routine, or the predictability of outcomes. These secondary benefits can quietly reinforce self-sabotage, making it harder to break free from established patterns. The origins of these patterns are frequently traced back to unresolved experiences from the past. Trauma, particularly when it occurs in childhood, can leave a profound and lasting imprint. Clinical research shows that adults who habitually engage in self-destructive behaviors, whether in relationships, careers, or personal pursuits, often have histories marked by trauma or disrupted parental care. The timing and nature of these early wounds matter. Events that occurred during formative years can shape not only how a person views themselves, but also how they perceive the world and their place within it. In some cases, coping mechanisms that once offered protection become maladaptive in adulthood, acting as barriers to growth, intimacy, or achievement. For example, a child who learns to stay quiet to avoid conflict in a turbulent home may carry that strategy into adulthood, where it manifests as reluctance to assert themselves or pursue challenging goals. The brain, always seeking safety, holds on to these old patterns even when they no longer serve their original purpose. Over time, these subconscious templates can become the default response to stress, risk, or opportunity. Self-sabotage is often maintained by a critical internal voice, a kind of anti-self that echoes the judgments, criticisms, or neglect experienced early in life. This voice can be subtle or relentless, but its message is consistent: you are not enough, you are unworthy, you are destined to fail. When these inner scripts go unchallenged, they quietly dictate choices, steering individuals away from growth or fulfillment. This process is frequently subconscious, operating outside of everyday awareness, which is why it can be so frustratingly difficult to change. In some cases, people who engage in self-destructive behaviors may not fully love or accept themselves, even if they believe they do. Self-perceptions can become compartmentalized, one part feeling competent and deserving, another part holding on to old shame, guilt, or inadequacy. This inner division can lead to behaviors that seem puzzling from the outside, such as turning down opportunities, ending relationships abruptly, or undermining one's own best efforts. Limiting beliefs and judgmental self-talk further reinforce self-sabotaging tendencies. When a person repeatedly tells themselves they are not capable or that failure is inevitable, these thoughts become self-fulfilling. A lack of clarity about personal values or goals can also contribute. Without a strong sense of what truly matters, it is easy to drift into patterns that are comfortable but ultimately unfulfilling. Sometimes, self-sabotage can be a bid for control. When life feels unpredictable or overwhelming, self-defeating behaviors can create a sense of predictability, even if the outcomes are negative. The brain may prefer the certainty of disappointment to the anxiety of uncertainty. In this sense, self-sabotage is not simply self-destruction, but a complex attempt to manage risk, pain, or fear. Substance use and other forms of escapism can also serve as coping mechanisms, especially when low self-worth or unresolved trauma is present. These behaviors may provide temporary relief from emotional pain or self-doubt, but they come at the cost of long-term well-being and often reinforce the cycle of self-defeat. In educational settings, self-sabotage can undermine academic engagement and erode self-esteem, especially among those who already feel vulnerable. The pattern is much the same: a quiet belief in one's own inadequacy, reinforced by experiences of difficulty or exclusion, leads to disengagement, avoidance, or giving up before trying. At the deepest level, self-sabotaging behaviors are not random acts of rebellion against one's own interests, but rather expressions of unresolved inner conflicts. They are shaped by the interplay of past experiences, ingrained beliefs, and the ever-present desire for safety and control. The good news is that understanding these roots is the first step toward change. When people begin to recognize the emotional and psychological origins of self-sabotage, they can start to unravel old patterns, challenge limiting beliefs, and build new ways of relating to themselves and the world. It is a process that requires patience, compassion, and a willingness to look honestly at the stories we carry. But as the roots of self-sabotage become visible, so too does the possibility of growth, of becoming an ally to oneself, rather than an unwitting adversary. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the threshold of something you deeply desire, a new opportunity, a healthier habit, a more fulfilling connection, and noticing, almost as if observing yourself from above, the quiet but persistent urge to pull back. Maybe it is a subtle distraction, a missed deadline, a sudden reluctance to ask for help, or a telling moment of forgetfulness just when it matters most. This is where the cycle of self-sabotage begins, not as a single action, but as a looping sequence with a life of its own. At the heart of this cycle lies a trigger, often so familiar it slips by unnoticed. Triggers can be situations that stir up stress, reminders of past disappointments, or simply the uncertainty that comes with the unknown. What makes these triggers so powerful is their ability to bypass our conscious intentions. Neuroscience tells us that the brain, always striving to predict and protect, conserves energy by relying on old, automated information. These triggers flip switches that set well-worn patterns into motion, sometimes before we have had a chance to think. Once the trigger is activated, the next step in the cycle is almost automatic. Negative thoughts, sometimes loud, sometimes whispered, begin to influence our choices. This might look like procrastinating on a project, failing to prepare for an important conversation, or resisting new experiences. For some, it takes the form of quietly declining support, even when it is genuinely needed, or repeating old relational patterns like picking unnecessary fights or holding back from intimacy. In the workplace, self-sabotage can appear as missed deadlines or a chronic inability to follow through, while in personal relationships, it might mean retreating just when closeness is possible. What is striking is how these behaviors often serve as coping mechanisms, offering a fleeting sense of relief or safety. The brain's amygdala, the region that helps process fear and threat, interprets uncertainty as danger. In response, it signals us to seek short-term comfort, avoiding the task, sidestepping the risk, or distracting ourselves, anything to escape the discomfort of vulnerability or the unknown. In the moment, these choices seem to solve the problem, soothing the immediate anxiety. Yet the relief is temporary. The real consequences of self-sabotage emerge over time. Goals remain out of reach, relationships falter, and the original stressors often grow more complicated. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Each instance of avoidance or resistance deepens the brain's association between the trigger and the need for escape. The old pathway becomes smoother, more automatic, until it feels less like a choice and more like an inevitable reaction. This automated repetition is a key reason the cycle of self-sabotage is so persistent. The brain prefers what is predictable and familiar, even when it is not healthy. Research suggests that these patterns can become so ingrained that they operate outside of conscious awareness. In other words, we may not even realize we are undermining ourselves until the negative consequences are unavoidable. Over time, the mind internalizes these negative patterns, so much so that even the brain's protective efforts end up working against our best interests. Interestingly, not everyone responds to these cycles in the same way. Experimental research has identified 3 distinct behavioral phenotypes: sensitives, unawares, and compulsives. Sensitives adapt their behaviors in response to negative outcomes, quickly learning from mistakes and shifting course. Unawares may need explicit feedback before making changes, only recognizing the connection between their actions and consequences once it is pointed out. Compulsives, however, persist in self-sabotaging choices despite repeated negative feedback. For these individuals, the causal link between action and outcome remains elusive, and the destructive pattern continues unchecked. This gap in awareness, failing to connect choices to their eventual results, helps explain why self-sabotage is so resistant to change. For some, the cycle continues simply because they do not see the thread tying their actions to their struggles. Without that insight, the motivation to break the cycle is weak and old habits dominate. There is another subtlety that keeps the cycle spinning. Self-sabotage is not always deliberate. Sometimes it is a conscious act, but more often it is driven by habits and thought processes that have become automatic over time. Repeated exposure to certain triggers, especially those rooted in stress or past trauma, strengthens these responses. The more frequently the pattern is played out, the easier it is for the brain to default to that script. Over time, even fleeting negative thoughts can set the cycle in motion, often before conscious reasoning comes into play. These ingrained patterns can be seen in the many forms of self-sabotage: forgetfulness, avoidance, procrastination, or resistance to support. They are not merely lapses in self-control, but are intimately linked to how the brain processes stress and perceives threat. When uncertainty or discomfort is interpreted as a danger signal, the brain's instinct is to retreat, to seek the safety of what is known, even if what is known is the very thing holding us back. There is hope in understanding this cycle, however. Research underscores that the cycle of self-sabotage is not immutable. It can be understood, challenged, and changed. The first step is awareness, learning to spot the triggers and patterns as they arise. Self-reflection exercises, such as expressive writing, have been shown to shift motivation from self-criticism to self-compassion, making it easier to pause and examine the cycle rather than acting on autopilot. Values exercises, too, can help clarify what truly matters, creating a sense of purpose that disrupts the automatic flow of self-sabotaging behavior. Recognizing one's habitual responses is not always comfortable. It asks us to become more familiar with the unfamiliar, to tolerate the jitters of change, and to notice the subtle ways we trip ourselves up. But with each moment of awareness, the automated pattern loses a bit of its grip. Over time, new habits and thought processes can be formed, gently steering us away from the old cycle and toward choices that align with our deeper goals. It is important to acknowledge that breaking the cycle is not an event, but a process. Persistent patterns rarely dissolve overnight. The brain's love of predictability means that it will take time and repetition to install new habits in place of the old. But every effort to notice a trigger, pause a reaction, or reflect on a consequence is a step in the right direction. Ultimately, the cycle of self-sabotage is a testament to the brain's complexity, its drive to protect, even when protection comes at a cost. By understanding the triggers, recognizing the patterns, and cultivating new ways of responding, it is possible to loosen the hold of self-sabotage. The journey begins with seeing the cycle for what it is, not a flaw in willpower, but a habit of mind and brain that can, with patience and self-compassion, be gently and persistently changed. Breaking free from self-sabotage is not as simple as flipping a switch or making a single heroic decision. Instead, it is a journey, a process of learning, unlearning, and relearning how to respond to our own thoughts and feelings. For anyone who has found themselves undermining their own progress, the good news is that change is possible. In fact, almost any form of self-sabotage can be overcome. The key is to begin by interrupting the ingrained patterns of thought and action that keep us stuck, and then to nurture the mindset and habits that support our true goals and values. The first, and perhaps most important, step is cultivating awareness. While it may sound simple, increasing awareness of the thoughts and feelings that drive self-sabotaging behavior is the foundation for regaining control. When you start to notice the subtle cues, perhaps a tightening in your chest before a big decision, or a familiar inner voice whispering doubts, you create a small but crucial gap between impulse and action. In that gap lies the power to choose a different response. Mindfulness practices can be especially helpful here, as they train the mind to observe experiences without immediate judgment or reaction. Over time, this awareness can disrupt the automatic cycles that have kept self-sabotage in place. Once you begin to recognize these patterns, self-reflection deepens the process. Expressive writing, for example, is a powerful tool for this stage. By putting your thoughts and feelings on paper, you can safely explore not just what you do, but why you do it. Many people find that when they write freely about a self-sabotaging episode, new insights emerge. Perhaps an old fear, an unspoken value, or a long-held belief about what is possible. Self-reflection is not about blame, but about honest curiosity. It is the process of getting to know yourself as you are, so you can become who you wish to be. Understanding your triggers is another essential strategy. Everyone has certain situations, people, or emotions that set off self-defeating behaviors. By identifying these triggers, you can begin to anticipate and prepare for them. Sometimes, simply naming a trigger like, "I tend to avoid difficult conversations when I feel criticized," can reduce its power. With practice, you can greet these triggers not as enemies, but as signposts pointing toward areas ready for growth. Practicing self-compassion is vital throughout this journey. Overcoming self-sabotage is about progress, not perfection. It is easy to fall into the trap of self-criticism, especially when you notice yourself repeating old patterns. Yet research shows that kindness toward yourself is far more effective than harshness. Self-compassion allows you to see mistakes as opportunities for learning, rather than as confirmation of inadequacy. If you slip, as everyone does, you can gently guide yourself back to your intentions, rather than spiraling into shame or defeat. Changing self-sabotaging behaviors often involves shifting the way you talk to yourself. Negative self-talk, that relentless inner critic, thrives on old narratives and unchallenged beliefs. One practical technique is to recognize and name this inner critic. Giving it a label, perhaps the doubter or the perfectionist, can help you distinguish it from your core self. When you notice the critic's voice, you can respond with positive affirmations or simply acknowledge its presence without submitting to its message. Cognitive restructuring, a cornerstone of cognitive behavioral therapy, involves challenging unhelpful thoughts and replacing them with more balanced, supportive ones. For example, changing "I always mess things up" to "I have struggled before, but I am learning new ways to respond" gradually builds a more compassionate internal dialogue. Therapy can be an invaluable support in this process, especially when patterns are deeply rooted or difficult to shift alone. Modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy are designed to help people replace negative thought patterns, improve emotional regulation, and cultivate new, healthier habits. Therapy is not just for moments of crisis, it is a laboratory for self-discovery and practice where you can safely experiment with new ways of thinking and acting. Sometimes, self-sabotage persists because underlying fears have not been addressed. These fears can range from fear of rejection to worry about losing control, and acknowledging them is a courageous act. Identifying and working through fears, whether with a therapist, a trusted friend, or through reflective practices, can open the door to new choices. Self-compassion and kindness are crucial tools for facing fears. When you approach your fears with patience rather than force, you invite healing instead of resistance. Another important strategy is to clarify your values. When you know what truly matters to you, it becomes easier to make decisions aligned with those values, even in the face of old habits. Values exercises, such as listing your top 5 priorities or describing the kind of person you want to become, can provide a compass for change. When you encounter a moment of potential self-sabotage, you might pause and ask, does this action bring me closer to or further from my values? Over time, this simple check-in can help reorient your behavior toward what you care about most. Building self-esteem is also a powerful antidote to self-sabotage. When you believe in your own worth and abilities, you are less likely to undermine yourself. This does not mean cultivating arrogance or perfection, but rather embracing your strengths and accepting your limitations with grace. Self-esteem grows through consistent, small acts of self-respect, setting boundaries, honoring your needs, and celebrating incremental progress. Practical habit change is another crucial piece. Old habits are sticky because they are familiar and, to some degree, comforting. To break free, it helps to form new, supportive habits that gradually crowd out the old ones. This might mean replacing the urge to procrastinate with a "just start for 5 minutes" rule, or swapping critical self-talk for a daily gratitude practice. The key is to focus on 1 or 2 changes at a time, allowing new behaviors to become part of your routine before adding more. For those who lead or aspire to lead, strategies drawn from successful female leaders offer additional inspiration. Honest self-expression, acting with confidence and owning all parts of oneself, strengths and flaws alike, are powerful antidotes to self-sabotage. These traits are not just for those in positions of authority, they can be cultivated by anyone willing to practice authenticity and courage in daily life. It is also important to recognize the domino effect of actions. Small changes, made consistently, can ripple outward, shifting not only your own patterns but also the way others respond to you. For example, asserting your needs in one relationship may embolden you to do the same elsewhere, gradually transforming your environment to be more supportive of your growth. Ultimately, breaking free from self-sabotage is about empowerment. It is about moving from the role of saboteur to that of protector, becoming the person who stands guard over your own well-being and goals. This often requires a mindset shift, viewing habits and beliefs as changeable rather than fixed, seeing setbacks as part of the journey, not the end, and believing in your capacity to grow, even when change feels uncomfortable. Every effort matters. Whether you are pausing to notice a trigger, practicing a new habit, or reframing a critical thought, you are laying the groundwork for lasting change. The journey is gradual, sometimes messy, and always uniquely your own. But with awareness, compassion, and the willingness to try again, you can move beyond old patterns and into a life that feels more authentic, purposeful, and free.